Should voters present a photo ID at the polls? And a new push to enhance early childhood education, we explain in Capitol Report. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Barkey. During the last legislative session, a bill passed and was later vetoed, requiring voters to present an ID at the polls. That legislation may have died, but the issue will resurface in 2012 in a slightly different form.
Have an idea that we want to require of those that cast a ballot, that we're going to require that they prove to us who they are and where they reside, I do not believe is too much to ask, because I also believe that along with the very, very important right to vote, there also comes a certain amount of personal responsibility. And with that personal responsibility accompanies the right to vote.
We worked hard with the governor on quarterly campaign finance reporting. We did everything that we knew about, that we thought the governor was interested in, met with him and so on. And so we'll just take this directly to the people. It's their election day, and let them speak as to what they want on their election day.
And I will grant you that polls show broad support for the concept of a photo ID. I think the real question is if people actually understand what that does to people's ability to vote, the burden that they're placing on seniors especially to vote, whether that broad support remains. And I guess by putting it on the ballot, they are going to require that Minnesotans get a lot more educated about this photo ID proposal, even though it has really no point, no purpose in our election system.
Representative Mary Kiffmeyer joins me now to talk about her moving the constitutional amendment forward next session. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Representative Kiffmeyer, the governor has spoken. He vetoed the bill last session, so you are leading the effort to bring it forth in 2012 as a constitutional amendment. Why take the issue to the voters?
Well, generally speaking, when you understand that it's the voters' election, that's the day when the people govern. So on election, you hear about government of the people, by and for them. When on election day, it's their day. And what better thing for them to be able to vote on the constitutional amendment for photo ID, because it's for all of the voters on election day. And since about 85% of the Minnesota people do support a requirement of photo ID, matter of fact, the largest support amongst the young people, and also amongst women. That's where the heaviest base of support is, but it never drops below 70%. So I think the voters have really shown that they want photo ID, and since the governor vetoed and has been insistent that he's not going to do photo ID, then I think it's also just a really good thing to let the people have their say, have their voice on something that pertains to their very own election, something that they experience when they go to vote.
And we asked the governor that question today, and we'll air his response a bit later in this program, but he essentially said that he might support the bill if there's broad bipartisan support. What do you think might have to happen to get this broad bipartisan support? You
know, what's amazing is that even 60% in the survey, 60% of the Democrats support photo ID. So I think in the broadest term and the best term of broad bipartisan support, that should include the people, the Democrat people out there who are not legislators but have an opinion about this, and a very, very strong base of support, and a very bipartisan, independents, Republicans, and Democrats, all well mixed in all age groups, strongly support photo ID. But the governor has decided to define, last I know, that bipartisan support only means legislators. And in the House, we did have 2 Democrats voting for the bill. In the Senate, there weren't any of the Democrats who voted for the photo ID bill, which is really interesting when you consider the broad base of public support amongst Democrats for photo ID.
Now, you once held the office of Secretary of State. What are some of the concerns that stem from your time in that office that motivate you to try to pass this bill?
Well, actually, my interest and desire for photo ID is way before being Secretary of State. I was an election judge for 11 years. And I read the election law through several times instead of Reader's Digest when things were slow. One of those weird people who, my dad was a tax preparer, so I am my father's daughter. But as I read through that and as I experienced working in the polling place on election day, way back to then, I said, why not an ID? Anderson with an O-N, with an E-N. Is that William, Bill, Will, or W with Jim, and you go by your, I mean, just show me your ID, and I think we can help those lines go faster. But I was not allowed as an election judge to ask for the ID unless I really questioned things, and it was just a different time. But I always thought, so my roots in that is way beyond that. And matter of fact, the U.S. Supreme Court and the other courts who have upheld the photo ID in other states, such as Georgia, and the U.S. Supreme Court, which have upheld it as well, say that you don't need the purpose of the photo ID to deter fraud, to detect fraud, and most importantly, to increase public confidence, and are sufficient reasoning to implement a photo ID legislation as long as you give them free to those who cannot afford them, which my bill would have given as well, as other states do. But for me, the increase in public confidence, this is the voters, that this is their election day, to increase their confidence in the process they're participating in is the biggest driver for me in photo ID.
So what's more important in your opinion? High voter turnout, some say that would diminish, and Minnesota is obviously nationally recognized for its high voter turnout. Is the high voter turnout, in your opinion, a greater value than preventing fraudulent voting?
I don't think that's a proper way to phrase it. I remember one of the DFL representatives said to me, well, you Republicans really care about integrity, but us Democrats, we really care about access. And I said, you know, you don't quite have that right. We care about the integrity of the election with the access. So it's putting those two together, both access and integrity. Both of those coming together in the implementation of our election laws. And I think it's interesting that in Georgia, as a matter of fact, in Indiana, that was the test case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, their voter turnout increased. And because they have party registration, what was interesting to note is increased most amongst the Democrat voters. And so this whole notion that it depresses voter turnout is absolutely not true. I believe when you increase the integrity of elections and you increase public confidence, you will increase that. Now, there is a difference between a gubernatorial year voter turnout and a presidential year. But in Indiana, they have a few years now to go by, and it has overall, in a very positive way, by 1 or 2 percentage points, has increased the voter turnout.
In Wisconsin, with the recall election, voters were required to present an ID. However, they were able to vote even if they didn't have a photo ID with them. Did you see any hiccups in the system?
I haven't heard a word. And that always tells you if you haven't heard a word. Now, I've read the articles, read through them the other night, kind of looking for issues or things, but it wasn't there when you consider the fact that it was the first implementation of the new photo ID requirement and went off very smoothly. I think we greatly underestimate our voters, that they are quite competent and quite capable, and matter of fact, quite eager to be able to show their ID, this is who I am, and especially even new citizens. When they're voting for the first time, they're like, please ask for my ID. I want to show you I'm a U.S. citizen and I get to vote, and this is such a wonderful thing. And so I think we underestimate the voters and their willingness and even eagerness in many cases to participate.
And on the House floor, Representative Marion Green brought up in particular absentee voting and how can one ensure that that person exactly. Yes. So what is your response to that
Well,
issue?
it's an equivalency issue, realizing that our soldiers or other people that are doing business can't be there in the polling place on election day. They can go vote in person an absentee ballot and fulfill the requirement there. But what we also required in the bill was on the absentee ballot application, we already have a witness signature, which is similar as far as practicable implementation of that verification. And then the other thing is that we'll be collecting their driver's license number or ID number so that we can do the same verifications to show that they're not on a felon list, whatever those things are, that we can, check with the DPS that it's a valid license and all that. So on the absentee voting, a matter of fact, on absentee voting, you have a little more time to process the application and do some of those things. And then realizing with the implementation of this, I think we've put together a well thought out bill. And again, it's been modeled after Indiana, which has already been upheld in the U.S. Supreme Court as constitutional, and in Georgia as well. And what's interesting about Georgia, they're a state that has to have pre-clearance to change their election law from the Department of Justice, which they received, and later the same policy was upheld in the court as well. Okay. So I think we're in a good place.
We're out of time, unfortunately, but we'll track your legislation next session when it's introduced. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Governor Mark Dayton's veto of the 2011 voter ID legislation came as no surprise to the bill's authors. The governor contends he would only support a renewed effort to pass photo ID if the proposal has broad support with both parties.
The bill that was passed last year that I vetoed was just didn't even address the issue of so-called felons, ostensibly voting improperly or illegally because of the mechanism they set up, requiring a photo ID. You can have a driver's license or other form of identification and be a felon and not have that recognized. So it didn't. The County Attorneys Association had an approach that really addressed some of the I think, very small amount of voter fraud in Minnesota, but any fraud's too much. So I think there are ways, if they want to make a political statement, they'll do what they did last year. They'll just pass something partisan, and maybe they'll put it on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. If they want to really get something done in a constructive way, my requirement's the same as Governor Pawlenty had, and Governor Carlson had. We just got to be broad bipartisan support, and it should be.
Last May on the House floor during the voter ID debate, Representative Marion Green brought forth a compelling argument against the bill, giving some history of her family and how it molds her views on this topic. She's here now to go into a little more depth on the issue. Representative Green, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Julie.
That introduced my first question for you. Tell us a little bit about what your family experienced and how it did kind of, again, shape your views on this particular topic.
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned on the House floor, my parents worked in the Foreign Service for the U.S. government, civil servants working outside the United States, and they voted absentee regularly throughout their entire careers. And the current bill, whether it's a constitutional amendment or passes as statutorily, sets up ambiguous requirements for absentee voters, and I'm concerned that it'll disenfranchise people who are living outside the U.S., whether they're working for the U.S. government, in the private sector, in the armed services. I'm concerned that steps that we've taken to enable those people to vote and participate we're going to move backwards.
So how would you like to see the language tightened to include absentee voters?
I don't support the bill,
right.
So I think
we'll
I think that brings me really to my kind of number one reason why I don't support the bill, which is that it's a solution looking for a problem. We don't have a problem. We could get concerned that 38, I believe, when county election officials were polled, 38 felons tried to vote. But this bill doesn't address that issue. And we don't have a voter impersonation problem in Minnesota. And I really would turn actually even to the testimony of the lawyer in charge of former Senator Norm Coleman's recount effort, who said, we looked for fraud and we just didn't find it.
Okay, and adding to that, now roughly six states nationally did pass voter ID laws this past year. Now, is there anything that could be done, any language that could be inserted, policy that would change your mind and you could support this?
Well, something that they've done, I believe it's in North Dakota, I think is very interesting, where they have people who don't have an ID on the day of an election can swear or affirm that they are who they say they are. So something like that would give me comfort. But I will say that the Minnesota system is very similar to that today. So really, do we need this? Additionally, there's the cost. As we know from the session and the special session, Minnesota doesn't have a spare dime. And so I'm not sure that we want to spend it on something that's of questionable value.
And as we know, Wisconsin just incorporated a similar bill and a similar law, and during the recall election, they did ask for voter ID at the polls, but they did allow voters to vote if they did not have a photo ID with them. Mm-hmm. Were there any hiccups as far as you're aware? And do you think this might be a model for other states such as Minnesota? I'm
not aware of any hiccups, so I think that's an interesting example. I know that here in Minnesota, the proposal is to have people do a provisional ballot, and that is not a solution to me. A provisional ballot is not a real ballot, and the idea is that people participate and get to vote, and it's a right.
Okay, I want to ask you next a little bit about this upcoming legislative session. It is likely it's expected anyway, to pass the legislature as a constitutional amendment. Yeah. So if so, given that most polls do indicate that the majority of Minnesotans are in favor of voter ID, how actively will you campaign against this?
I'll campaign it'll be some of what I talk about, but I will say that in other states, voter ID initiatives are now kind of mired in the court, and it's going up through the court system. So I think that also is a way that this is going to get taken care of. There are some other issues on the ballot next year that I feel very strongly about as well, and so I may be talking about them first. One thing I have noticed about this issue when I talk with friends and colleagues is that at first it sounds okay. What's wrong with showing an ID? As proponents say, we show one when we cash a check, we show one when we charge a burger at McDonald's. What's the problem? But the challenge is that not everybody has an ID, and and ordering a burger at McDonald's or cashing a check is not a right that we need to guarantee. And so I am concerned, and when I point this out to people, they're like, oh yeah, at first it feels painless, but in fact I think we're going to disenfranchise people, and it connects with a kind of ugly part of our history that we really don't want to go back to.
And will that be the message that you convey?
Yes, because I've found that in 2 seconds, as soon as I remind people of, well, wait a second, this is how it's worked in a negative way, people immediately get nervous and realize that, wait, participating in our democracy is one of the great things about being an American, and we want to guarantee that.
On that note, Representative Green, thanks so much for joining us on Capitol Report today. We certainly appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
2 Minnesotans will now lead early childhood education as members of the Early Learning Council. Governor Mark Dayton and Commissioner of Education Brenda Casilius made that announcement on Wednesday. They say the council will advise lawmakers on the best way to access state and federal early childhood care and education programs.
The council will play a critical advisory role in promoting high-quality early learning for all children and helping us to align our best practices, which will improve outcomes and help us close our achievement gaps. One of their first tasks will be advising Governor Dayton and the Children's Cabinet and the legislature on Minnesota's Race to the Top application.
I think we recognize now the need for a continuum from our first months to the first years to all-day kindergarten to emphasis on reading proficiency in first, second, and third grade, and then remedial help for those who are in the early elementary grades and are behind in that undertaking. That's life transforming. I mean, that ability to read, because I saw it in the reverse in New York City when I taught there, that very bright kids, ninth graders, couldn't read or write beyond the second or third grade level, and through no fault of their own, they just weren't given the tools and the opportunity, and that's just life damaging. So this is conversely life transforming, and I think we'll see in the educational system starting 10 years and 20 years from now that it's going to really pay off.
Within days, the Minnesota Senate is expected to release its 2011 Minnesota State Fair survey. The questions typically represent the key issues facing the legislature, giving Minnesotans a chance to weigh in. The office tasked with putting in the research, gathering survey questions, and deciding on the final questionnaire is the Senate Information Office. But that office is tasked with many more responsibilities. Located on the second floor near the Senate chamber, the Senate Public Information Office is your first stop for help to navigate events at the Capitol. Let the friendly staff help answer your questions.
We're in essence a direct contact, first contact for the public. Who's my legislator? What district do I live in? What bills have been introduced? What committees are they in? Can I get a copy? Whatever questions they might have on the legislative process.
Good afternoon, Senate Information.
They can use our computer terminal and find out what committee meetings are taking place, check the status of a bill. If they don't know the bill number, they can do a subject search, an author search. They might come in to get our orders of business in terms of bill introductions, the agenda, the calendar for following a floor session. They might get the previous day's journal, get a copy of a bill, basically whatever they need to follow the day's goings-on. We're different in that we combine the public aspects of several different offices. Their chief clerk's office, room 211, bills and journals. Right next door, House Index. We basically handle most of the calls from the general public on the status of bills. And we also have some similar duties to House information in terms of what district do I live in, who's my legislator, pamphlets, materials, that sort of thing. We have the Senate internship program, college students earning credit, working for the members. We have, I believe, 64 students this year, and we provide the selection process, the orientation program, and then various supplemental programs for the students. We're very accessible. Any questions they have, whether finding out who their legislator is, what bills that have been introduced, general process questions. If it's a question we can't directly answer, we'll promise to put them in contact with those who can.
Earlier this summer, the Minnesota Senate lost a longtime member. Senator Linda Scheid passed away after a lengthy battle with ovarian cancer. We're going to leave you now with a look at her storied career.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to go on and on about this. I've been working on trying to reform some of our no-fault law for a number of years now. And I think
she tried to take parts of people's ideas whenever she could, tried to compromise, and it was her philosophy to try to get something done and signed into law. And sometimes she knew that that required compromise and working with everyone involved. She hired me on to be her legislative assistant, and I did that job for 3 years. So Linda and I were together every day. I made sure her bills were in order, her calendar was in order, her constituent letters were in order. Linda had a reputation of being very good to the staff and being very bipartisan and good to all the members. It was very, very important to her to treat everyone with respect.
She was a very hard worker, a very tough negotiator, but at the end of the day, she was always willing to make a deal. And she felt strongly about legislation she was working on, but she always understood that at the end of the day, when the deal was made, both sides had to come away feeling like they got a little something that they needed in the legislation.
Linda Scheid was a devoted teacher, particularly in the Brooklyn Center school system. She was a substitute teacher, but she was a regular, and it's very clear that she loved those students that she taught.
I left the committee for 2 years, and I was very distressed over that. So I'm really glad to come back on.
Education was incredibly important to her, and it was just, all about students and parents, and, just really, really concerned about those issues. With Linda, it was, you got the sense as a legislator and as a person that she really walked the walk and talked the talk, that what she believed in was how she legislated, and it didn't matter. I mean, that gave her, she was, very well respected on both sides of the aisle.
She always extended herself to the minority and made the minority, I think, feel as part of the process. And as a result, I think her legislative career will be looked back upon as one which certainly a lot of important pieces of legislation evolved from her efforts, and they're good legislation, and they will move with us on to the future, but always, I think she understood the importance of involving the minority and the diversity of views that goes with putting together a good legislative product.
She had some very strongly held principles, and that's how she voted. It was I don't think ever felt political with Linda. It was always what she firmly believed, and if she agreed with you, then she was completely unafraid and happy to step up and support a piece of legislation that she believed in.
When Senator Scheid was in the House of Representatives, she told me the story as her staff person about how there was a proposal that was a DFL proposal, and she did not want to vote for the proposal because she felt it would impact her constituents negatively. So she refused to vote for it, and they came to her and said, you have to vote for it, and she refused, and so they kicked her off the tax committee. That is the kind of principles that Senator Scheid had, and felt that it was in her best interest to represent her constituents to the best of her ability. She did that, and sometimes that made her friends with both sides, and sometimes that made people mad from both sides.
She knew the art of compromise. She knew how to negotiate from interests rather than positions, and to, on a number of occasions, to find a solution on a policy issue in which there might have been a great deal of controversy.
Linda was known as a principled, bipartisan legislator. She took pride in that, and she took pride in looking out for her constituents, no matter what cost it was to her politically. She's a true leader, and I think she will be remembered very well here at the legislature.
I never, in the years that I worked with her, ever heard her say a bad word about anybody on either side of the aisle. I never heard her say, when things were, difficult issues were in front of her committee, anything negative about people on either side of issues. She just was the kind of person that wanted to work hard, try to find some compromise on issues that were in front of her for her ultimately as the chair to try and broker an agreement on.
I know she'll be missed. She was a lovely lady who everyone enjoyed working with. She was always very kind and thoughtful, and that's something that we very much need. Well, we need everywhere, right? Not just in St. Paul, but everywhere, and she's one of the good ones.
Well, I want Senator Scheid to be known for being a consummate legislator, one who came to the Capitol, I think for all the right reasons, who worked hard, who exemplified, I think, for all of us, what a legislator, a good legislator truly is. And I think through her life at the Capitol, and I enjoyed 9 years of that here, we come to know her, to respect her, to admire her. We love her, and certainly life. We certainly miss her in death, and our respect and admiration will always be there, and we will remember her with great fondness.
She knew what it meant to be a loyal friend, and she herself probably was a lot of people's best friend, which I think is the highest compliment you can give to a person.
That's going to wrap up this week's program. I'm Julie Bartke from all of us at Senate Media Services. Thank you for watching Capitol Report.